Hi, I'm Jane Schrader, and I'm so glad that you're with us tonight. The agenda for this evening is to create an overview of the coaching process, dispel some of the myths that might be out there, and then most importantly move on to a panel of individuals who have experienced the coaching process firsthand, as well as the return on the investment they made in that process. So welcome, and I look forward to having you with us tonight.
So Julie, if you want to start out, just a brief background. It's such an interesting background. You first, Julie.
Okay, me first. So my background, I have been privileged to be, prior to Mark and I acquiring Lauber, my career was exclusively in the nonprofit sector. And I had the privilege of working for some of Milwaukee's great institutions, Marquette University for a combined 20 years. I was the president of UPath, and I was the president and CEO of the Milwaukee YMCA, and took them through a very challenging Chapter 11 restructuring. So I come to this very much from the perspective of talent, talent retention, talent optimization, from a service organization's perspective, because people truly are your most important asset. And if you're not serious about that, you generally don't achieve what you can.
So, my name is Joe Teglia. For 30 years, I worked for a Southeast Wisconsin asphalt and concrete paving and asphalt production company. The firm was started in 1959 by my father and owned from 1990 to 2010 by myself and my sister in a 50-50 partnership. In 2010, I sold my interest to my partner, and staying with the company, moved into a sales role. In 2015, Black Diamond Group ended operations, and I started Site Advice LLC, which is the company I own and operate now. I am a one-person show offering project-based, owner representative, and project management services. Is that short and sweet enough for you, Scott? Okay.
Linda gets our gold star for today. Her voice, we'll see how it comes out right now, but big round of applause. Thank you, Linda, for coming.
So I will first ask for your forgiveness for my voice, so I'll do my best, and if you can't understand me, Jane will translate for me. I started my career as a professional musician, and in high school, actually, and after a long period of time doing that, in about 20 years ago, I started working in the nonprofit sector, leading nonprofit organizations. So my entire career has been in the nonprofit sector, and interestingly enough, in the arts field. I was the executive director of the Waukesha Symphony, which is now the Wisconsin Philharmonic. Then was the COO at the United Performing Arts Fund after Julie, and have been at the Milwaukee Youth Symphony Orchestra for the last 7.5 years.
So Julie, if you want to start out for us, please. So what was going on at Marquette specifically, I think, is what we're going to talk about here, with the organization, yourself personally, in terms of what you were thinking and what you're dealing with that really made you consider the coaching process?
I went back to Marquette for my second 10-year chapter in 2003, and it was asked to think and put a plan together for how the organization could go, basically 2 to 3 times what they'd been doing from a fundraising perspective. Put a plan together, and the university would figure out how to fund that. So we benchmarked leading universities around the country who had similar characteristics, and put a plan together that would look at growth from a budgetary perspective of, basically 2x, but the goal was to grow 3 times in terms of revenue and fundraising. And we started to implement those changes, and lots of bumps along the way. And I considered myself a good communicator. I felt like I understood some managing change, but here's the thing about managing change. Even those of us who are enthusiastic and like to raise our hands and say, yeah, I kind of like change. Thing is, we like change on our terms. We don't really like it. And even in an enlightened organization where you have a lot of input into change, when it actually means you have to change, that's a little uncomfortable. And people don't like to be uncomfortable in a public context. I had benefited from coaching in my own career and knew it to be a way to really develop different muscles, different professional muscles. And I had the great opportunity of working with someone, and we created something of an embedded model, which I guess I'll talk about later. But I saw the need very much not just for the top executive team, but really a human organization needs human development. And if you're serious about that, and when you actually have to rely almost 100% on your people to, there's no manufacturing, there's nothing but people to deliver the message and the product, you really need to support them in a way that is bigger than I think most people appreciate.
Linda, you had an interesting challenge. You stepped into some big shoes. Kind of share with us your story.
So I started at the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra following an individual who had been there for 24 years and had grown the organization in really fabulous ways. But it was a very, very small team, and the board hired me in order to help the organization move to its next level and the level it needed to be at. And so I had hired Jane as a personal coach on a career change. I thought I was leaving the nonprofit sector in 2011, and after having gone back to school and realized that my role needed to be in where I ended up. So I had some experience with coaching when I came into the organization. I was offered an executive coach when I started, but knew I needed to spend some time with the organization understanding the individual opportunities and challenges that the team that was there had before I brought in a coach. So I then re-engaged Jane to work with me personally, and after a period of time rolled it out with our leadership team. We worked with them for a year, and then I rolled it out to the entire staff for another year. So in total at MISO, I've worked with Jane for a total of 3 years over that course of time. It's been an enormous opportunity for us that we can talk about more.
Joe, yours is more of a personal journey. Very interesting one at that. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit of the background there.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I was involved in a family business for 30 years, 20 years as a 50% owner of the company and vice president of construction operations. So everything that got built, I had my hand in it. In early 2010, I realized that I was coming to my job with far less passion than I needed, and not only was personally unsatisfied, but fully realized that if I continued to run my business that way, it wasn't going to be good. So I decided that it was time for a change. The first part of that was, of course, negotiating a sale of my business interests with my partner, which honestly, in the scope of what I started, the journey I started on, was the easy part of that. What I realized, though, is once that was done, is I really didn't know what I was going to do next. I had no idea. As a business owner, my partner and I used consultants for years. I mean, there's the standard ones, right? The attorneys and the accountants and, to rent a CFO, if I can sell what you guys sell.
Trusted business partner.
Trusted business partner. So when it was suggested to me that I engage a career coach, it made a ton of sense to me. And so that is how I ended up finding myself in a coffee house talking to Jane probably the first time. So, and I think, I look at my notes, so that's the end of that part of that story, Scott.
Very good. Julie, as you began the process of integrating this into your organization, what were some of the hurdles you had to overcome? I don't think so much yourself, because you were an advocate, as you said, but what about for the team? What are some of the hurdles, or even the greater organization that you had to work through?
Yeah, so we made the decision, and I did engage, the leadership team was involved in every bit of this decision, to redeploy a resource. In our world, we call them lines. So redeploy a line that had been designated for revenue generation, a major gifts fundraiser position, and put it to having an embedded coach. And the model we put in place was this person would be, and it wasn't Jane. I didn't know Jane then, but a big part of my belief in this work is my time at Marquette and my big belief in why Jane's extraordinary career will create value for so many in our community is just my belief in this work. So the notion was you had office hours, and they were a full-time employee of the organization. And it was completely anonymous to me. So the deal was I never knew who met with. In this case, it was Colleen Fitzgerald. I never knew who. That was the deal. It would never be revealed to management, and this was an opportunity for every employee, from an office associate to the direct reports to me, to individually engage in goal setting, skills development, and just professional development. And we then had, Colleen worked with each team, any team leader that wanted to, and be assured, by the time we built the organization, and we went from 68 employees to 155 employees, we went from raising about $28 million a year to our high water mark of $132 million a year. That was not linear. It was not. It was over 4 years, but and lots of bumps. But the reality is, of course, some people are resistant to this. But at the end of the day, my willingness to say, you don't have to. This is all voluntary. Teams need to develop, and we need to work on that together. But I'm not asking you to go spend your time. But it kind of became a contagion. I to this day don't know the number of people who participated, but I can tell you that we saw, beyond the financial numbers, which were remarkable, we saw the big change in employee engagement, which we'd been measuring through a Gallup survey annually, which was terrible when we started. We had about 79% annual turnover. We were down to 6% in the 4-year period that we worked together. And then the other thing was, when we talk about ROI, from my perspective, I think about attrition, I think about employee engagement, and of course fundraising results, but it's supposed to be fun. And so we just saw such a difference in terms of how people showed up and cared for each other. So I am a 100% believer in it.
Joe, what about yourself? Again, a little different perspective. You had family members. And, one of my favorite myths that Jane helps bust is that warm, fuzzy thing. They looked at you and said, what's this coaching thing all about? How did you work through that thing?
Well, again, as I stated earlier, my sister and I were big believers in consultants and, used people, trusted business partners, not only for the typical assistance that a small business has, but also used it for, strategic planning, team building. We were into it. We used it a lot. So for me, it was a natural, and I said this earlier, a natural transition for me to do it on a personal level. Again, mine is a personal journey, and once I started down that journey, it was my own and really didn't involve the business, although there's a little bit of twist to that, and we can talk about later. But, oftentimes you hear the story about the family business and, go out, young person, and find your career somewhere else, and when you've made all your mistakes, then it's time to come into the family business. Well, that's not how it worked in the Teglia household. And at 21 years old, with a degree in math and secondary education, I found myself 6 months after graduating college a paving guy. And from that became, a really nice title, Vice President of Construction Operations. So, I was managing 70 people. I was building $10-12 million worth of site and infrastructure projects in a year. So it became from not knowing what I was doing and to having a serious job. So when I found myself ready to stop doing that and look for something else, I had to answer a question that all of my kids answered probably at 21 years old. What is it you want to do when you grow up? And I realized that there was no way I was going to figure that out on my own. I would have likely failed miserably or more specifically, been unhappy in that transition because it was a huge change for me. I had people, they reported to me, and that was something I wanted to change. So now you look at my notes. So the thing for me, again, it's a personal journey, was the help and encouragement that I got through coaching, to find out things like, these are questions, realize in 30 years I'd never asked myself. What assets did I bring to the table? Never asked myself that, and through Jane's help, we started exploring that. What aspects of my current job transferred to others? I mean, some of you may think that's funny, but realize I worked at one place for 30 years. I had no clue if I was any good at what I did or not. I mean, did anybody really want to hire me? Jane? What I enjoyed about what I had done the last 30 years. And of course, the counter to that is what I wanted to stay away from. We explored what culture I would need in a new employer. That was one of the great realizations, I think, for me, is that the culture that my sister and I had built in a business was something pretty special. And although I think Jane took off her coaching hat and kind of went into the expert hat, it was, Joe, you're not going to find that culture elsewhere. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's something to think about. The discussions were in depth, involved a lot of hard work. I mean, some of the things that were up on the board, I think, touched on lightly, but it's hard work. I think, any of us can attest to that. This isn't just somebody telling you what to do, it's a lot of self-exploration. And my last point was would not have been possible for me to be successful without an experienced guide. I go back to, I had no clue. I didn't know which way. I mean, I had honestly coached employees, mentored employees. I had no idea how to do that for myself. So that's my story.
Linda, I think you shared already that you were a proponent. You were, you didn't need to be sold, but you had a team again, similar to Julie, right? And you had to convince them that this was the right thing. And if you don't mind weaving into that, your take on assessments, because that's part of the process as well. And some people resist that. And there's confidentiality issues. There's a lot of different things that go in that whole stew, if you would. If you don't mind talking about that a little bit.
So it started because I was very open with our leadership team about what I was doing. I was open about the coaching that I had been having one-on-one with Jane, and the opportunity to bring it forward started with our leadership team. In the nonprofit sector, it's unusual to be offered professional development and leadership training. And so everyone in the staff at the time that had direct reports had zero leadership training. They had no idea. They were thrust into that role. And some were naturally okay at it, and some of them were not so okay at it. And so the opportunity to roll it out first with that leadership team was the way I brought it to the fore was to tell them that this is an opportunity to learn how to lead, learn how to manage, learn how to explain, and work closely with better communication with their own direct reports and across the organization. So it started with a less scary idea. And we talked about how building communication and building an intentional culture was a piece of the puzzle. And by starting with the leadership team and seeing them embrace it, they were very excited about the opportunity to have actual training in how to do this work. That was not a difficult sell, but as part of that process, individually and then with our leadership team, and later with the rest of the staff, we started all of the work with these assessments that Jane mentioned. They were fascinating for many of our team, had never had them. They had never been through any of these standard business assessments that you probably are all familiar with. And if they hadn't had the depth and the level of experience that Jane brings to the table. So that was very eye-opening for them, and allowed them to be much more open to the process as their fears started to dissipate. When we rolled it out to the rest of our staff, which had grown from 6 to 12 over just a few years, part of the reason we did this was to create an intentional culture and build a different kind of culture than what it had been with such a small team. The change that Julie was talking about was very similar to what we were doing, and the growth that was expected of us was huge. And so we did the same assessments with the entire team. My willingness to be open with our leadership team and with our own staff when we did full staff meetings about this work and with the coaching helped everyone kind of get past their fears. There was one individual who was adamantly opposed to it. When he found out we were going to be going through a Myers-Briggs assessment, was abundantly clear with me that he had done it before and wanted no part of it and didn't believe in it, and was pretty clear in his lack of willingness to participate. And we talked him through it, and I had him speak one-on-one with Jane before all of it to sort of ramp down his negativity, because I knew that if I had let him go through with it, he would have been a real problem for the entire team and the entire office. And so Jane fabulously pulled him off the ledge and worked him through the process. He ended up being a big component of it. I don't think he had any idea, properly done, how well that kind of coaching and that kind of assessment could be utilized on behalf of not just himself, but of the whole team.
I'm kind of one of these hard ROI type people in terms of how I look at things. I think, Julie, you could have done a mic drop after you dropped the numbers you did before in terms of the increase, but I think there's also an interesting after story as you look at the ROI of the process that you put the organization. Are you okay sharing that?
I think so. You'll let me know if this is the one you mean. So the trajectory was extraordinary. Then there was 2009, fell pretty dramatically, started to rebuild and get pretty close back to that $100 million mark. I left Marquette in 2012, and I was just speaking with a colleague who's still there, and said, not long, maybe a year after I left, went to the YMCA, the coaching role was discontinued for the organization, and my former colleague said, honestly, that was a huge loss for us. It was another time of dramatic change for the organization, a new president, a new vice president, just lots of new. And again, change not on your own terms is hard. And so how you help people manage that and how you help people work together constructively. So unfortunately, I think as I look back on it, I think it's really an important thing to be disciplined in the work of coaching in a large organization, but even in a small one. To Linda's point, the ratios are the ratios. It's about helping each individual person understand their role as a leader, no matter what their title is, and giving them the ability to develop the skills they need. And when we sort of dismiss that or sort of suggest that isn't as important, it's a remarkably negative. I mean, they don't have to say it to say, they feel, I mean, it's not a disrespect, but it's kind of you take it away, and then the suggestion is they're not as valued.
Joe, when I asked you this question as we were kind of talking beforehand, I hope you remember your answer because it was an interesting one. Do you remember when I asked you what the ROI was?
I don't know. I said, I never thought about it in that way. Okay, there we go. I alluded earlier that my story is a little bit more complicated than it maybe was related at the beginning. So in 2010, when my sister and I came to an agreement on the sale of my ownership interest, the plan was that I was leaving, right? Who is a 30-year owner in a business and stays on after sale to his partner. I mean, that happens when there's an outside acquisition, sometimes, usually not successfully, but it rarely happens when it's an internal sale. So when I engaged Jane in 2010, it was with the purpose that Joe was going to leave and have to go do something else, certainly not related to that industry, because there was going to be a non-compete, surprise. So, the coaching started with that in mind, that I was going to have to figure out something else to do, which is kind of a scary thing when you do something for 30 years, but I was ready for it. I was so adamant that I was going to change my career. Partway through that process, my sister and the person who was going to become our COO came to me and said, well, we don't want you to leave, we want you to stay on and move into a sales role. So at that point, my coaching with Jane changed from what am I going to do next to, you think this is a good idea? And we worked through that whole process, and that not only involved Jane and I, but it involved what Jane and I talked about relayed then with my sister and the COO. So that happened. 2010 construction season, it was announced Joe's no longer an owner. On January 1st, I moved out of a really nice office to a cubicle, and I sold for 5 years happily and hugely successfully. So then in 2015, companies shutting down. It wasn't organized. Don't feel bad for me. It was a wonderful thing for everybody involved. Well, for I guess not everybody, but so now 2016, I'm unemployed. Actually unemployed for the first time. One of my first calls when we decided that was going to happen was to Jane saying, hey, remember what we started on back in 2010? We're going to finish it now. So we re-engaged and started a process about, okay, what's next for Joe Teglia? So, you know, ROI is tough. That usually has financial aspects rolling around in your head. For me, and I didn't actually realize this until just now, one of the ROIs for me is for the last 10 years, I have been exceedingly happy. Serious ROI, when you talk about coaching and an individual return on investment, exceedingly happy, exceedingly successful. I haven't missed out on anything. And I think I said this the other night, if I was to give my sales pitch, 2010 is when Jane and I met, early that year. We still have an ongoing relationship. It you know, re-emerged with zest in 2016, but you know, she's helped me figure out what's next, helped me figure out what's the upsides and downsides to running a one-person consulting business. I mean, every year, at least twice a year, I think we get together for coffee and conversation. So that's my sales pitch for it. This isn't just a one-time shot and you know, it's a boost and then you go on. This was something that I took very seriously. It had great personal success story, quite honestly, for me, and I don't think it would have been possible without an experienced guide. So,
thank you, Joe. Tough follow-up, Linda. But in terms of, as you look at it, the ROI, I think you're in the midst of it right now, right? With the organization and how it's developing.
We are, and I would say ditto to everything Joe said about the personal experience. I've been working with Jane since 2011, and it's a very similar kind of experience. We continue to get together. I would continue to work with her and our team. In fact, when I was telling them what I was doing tonight, all said, let's do this, let's do more of this, because the team itself felt valued, exactly what Julie was talking about, that we were willing to invest not just in the leadership. The rest of this staff was looking for that kind of support and that kind of opportunity. I have no idea what they talked about in their one-on-one meetings. I have no idea what they talked about when the leadership team wasn't in the room. They met without us. The leadership team met without me and talked about me. And I know some of what they talked about, but I don't know everything they talked about. But all of those pieces, what it created for our organization was a sense of openness and trust and an ability to communicate that didn't have a pathway before it. And so the opportunity to learn a common language, the opportunity to learn about and create a shared set of values that we all agreed upon, that we all understood. We still use all of that today. We still talk about it, usually at least several times a week, if not daily, because it becomes so embedded in the culture of our organization that as we bring new people in, we have them go through that process and we reintegrate them into the process so that they understand that shared language too. So the ROI for me is constant and ongoing, and I think it's constant and ongoing for our organization in really positive ways. We have great metrics, just like Julie did at Marquette on our fundraising. I can't say we raised $100 million, but over the last 7 years, actually over the last 4 years, we've seen a 40% increase in our contributed revenue. And in large part, it's because we work together as a team, where before we were working in silos.
Excellent. I'd be remiss if I didn't open it up to the floor right now. We've got a couple minutes here, so what didn't I ask? Phil?
I was intrigued by Joe's journey, and the first page here talks about coaching, aligning the individual to the organization, and I guess I'm more interested, when you're coaching the individual without the organization, without the ROI, without trying to increase EBITDA or revenue or contributions, and I'd be interested if I heard you right, you were doing this without your sister, without the organization, you were doing it for your own kind of journey direction, and to me that was fascinating, versus, almost every organization you go into, they're pounding for more revenue or less expenses or more EBITDA or more donations, that type of thing. So I'm just curious about anybody who would respond to kind of coaching the individual independent of the organization. Or let's say you get out of school with a math degree, you don't know what you want to do. Same with me, I got out of school with a math degree, and ended up just accidentally in business lending, and suppose you want to get into politics or something like that.
This is probably something for Jane to answer, but I have a comment about it. So as I mentioned, my partner and I for years used coaches and consultants. And I would say for me, it's one of those things that you have to let go of, is all of a sudden one of your team members are in there talking to somebody and you have no idea what they're talking about. And I guess it's entirely possible they could come out of that conversation and say, yeah, I'm leaving the company. Well, maybe that's okay. I mean, again, for me, I had decided to leave the company, so it was a different journey. But I don't know, I just, it's funny that you say that, because you have to let go, essentially.
I also did personal coaching, executive coaching with Jane, both before I left the United Performing Arts Fund and after, several years after I started at MISO. And my first iteration was that question of, what do I want to be when I grow up? I had been a professional musician for 30 years at that point. I had been working in the nonprofit sector. I had gone back to school. I had a bachelor's and a master's in music performance. Talk about what are you going to do with that when you grow up. I'd gone back to school and I got an MBA, and I was coming out of that thinking, what's the next thing? And that's what started my path with Jane. And the opportunity, personally, I thought I was leaving the nonprofit sector. I thought I was going to get a job in the for-profit world. That's what I went into the coaching with. And coming out of it, the depth and the personal reflection that Jane helped me work through found my path in the nonprofit sector. I realized I did not think that's where we were going to end up. But because of the way she walked me through in a path that I might have been able to do on my own, but not nearly as successfully and not nearly as with as much intention, the understanding that the sector that I'm in and the work that I do aligns with my personal values, so that for intentionally I could align my personal and my professional values in a place where I feel like I'm doing the work that I was intended to do. I'm not sure I would have gotten there without her help.
I should have had Jane slide here a little bit. Any other questions? Because Jane's included slide a little bit there. Yes, please.
So I'm another one that has had the benefit of Jane's expertise over the years. Years ago, I hired Jane as a coach, and what Joe and Linda said, and then some, I can't recommend her enough. But I do have a question. So that was a personal relationship, it still is. But my role has always been working with owners of firms. there may be one person who might need coaching in your mind more than anybody else, who would be that individual who would fight it more than anyone else. So Linda mentioned before that you had an issue like that at MISO. So, and you said you just like delightfully brought them into the fold. How do you go about
Wasn't quite that easy.
Yeah, right, yeah, I'm sure it wasn't. I mean, because individuals I've worked with that I have in mind, you know, it's a kind of a tough thing that, you know, there'd be a hallelujah chorus if they jump in and actually, you know, make those necessary improvements that would benefit the entire organization. But how did you do that? How did you?
It was tough, admittedly. But, you know, as a coach, I think one of the most important things when I engage with an individual is readiness. And their personal readiness is just so important because, just as these two said, it's hard work. You know, you have to be ready to engage the process. And not everyone is. And this particular individual in Linda's organization, he had just had a bad experience, and I've run into that a lot for different coaches, different styles, different assessment tools that are handled differently, different expectations at the beginning of an engagement. And so it was really just a matter of understanding what his armor was and helping him to trust me enough to say, just give it a shot. You know, just let's give it a shot. You know, if it doesn't work for you, we'll have another conversation. But it was a dramatically different experience for him. So, and I wanted to address Phil's, just come back for a minute here and say that in my private practice before joining Lauber, I have worked primarily with individuals that come to me on their own and say, I need this help. It's not everybody. And a lot of times it's not the person that probably needs it the most, to Jean's point. But there is a certain readiness when an individual really wants to move forward and they know that at this point they have a gap and they need something to help fill that gap. And so they will, you know, engage the process.
We want to be respectful of everybody's time. The panel will be hanging out here. Mark's going to do a quick wrap up here, but I think the bar and food will stay open for a little while. So let's give a round of applause, please. Well, thank you again, panel. We really appreciate it. Great insights. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you taking time out of your week here. As Scott said, the bar and food will stay open for a while, as always, at a Lauber function. So thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to talk to the panel, talk to Jane. You know, we're always interested in helping people figure out their path. So thank you very much. Enjoy the evening, and we'll see you outside here. Thank you.